part 6. So we've had lots and lots of technical sessions in the past, which the recordings are all available on our website. If you want to go there and register, you can make them available. Today we're focusing on an economic assessment. So obviously, as we build out our business case, our leadership teams often need to see the numbers and stack up, and it is quite different to the on-prem, and that's what we're going to compare and contrast. So what's it like to build up a CapEx based model for VDI versus the new world of OpEx in AVD and cloud-based? And I'll show you some of the differences and benefits. Okay, just a bit of a reminder that we are recording the session so that they can go on our website and people can review them at their leisure. It is a discussion series, so please ask questions along the way. More than happy for myself and the team to answer as much as we can. We'll make sure that we post out all the content afterwards so you can have it available. So today's agenda. We thought we'd start by just reminding ourselves of some of the benefits of VDI and DAS and why we do it in the first place. Just a quick slide or two on that. And then we'll start looking at some of the challenges with on-prem. And I've actually covered off in the slide deck some of the sort of technical challenges that impact on cost before diving a bit deeper into those traditional cost models versus AVD. Once we've done that, we'll then sort of talk a bit about how you might start to build up a business case, right? And so the sort of method that you would use to do that and how that sort of differs and changes a little bit for a cloud-based service. And then finally, we've got a couple of slides at the end on the economic assessment, which we do for our clients. So we've packaged that up into an offering that we have, and we'll just tell you how we go about doing that, right? and the steps that are involved in that. Okay. So what are the benefits of VDI and DAS, and why do we do it in the first place? Well, obviously, I think and the traditional method of or reason we use VDI is often that we want to put the application and the user's interface as close as possible to the data, and that's particularly important when we have legacy applications and chatty apps. I was talking to a client the other day that had said every screen that they open up on their line of business application makes approximately 100 calls back to the database. And obviously, if we've got that very chatty across large latency impacted networks, that's not great, right? And so we want to put the client and the application right next to the data and the workloads in the back. So we try and do that. But also there's a lot of sort of fringe benefits around VDI and DAS, right? So and in particular, I think one of the most important ones is probably that security. So when we do have a VDI solution, we're actually leaving the data inside our corporate networks, right? So it's not out there on a laptop somewhere that can be stolen or lost or impacted in other ways. You're not traversing a network that we might not have, full control over. We're keeping it in the data center where we know we've got probably our best security, and that's certainly the case when we move things to the cloud. You'll see some more comments on security a bit later on. And often it can also, if it's done right and it works well, can enhance the user's experience, right? So the end user will have a much better interaction with an application that is needing to consume all that data and being close to the back end, right? So we can actually get benefits to that. Now that isn't always true with VDI, and I think having done 25 years of using things like Citrix, etc., we know that can be challenging, right? But the end user experience, I think, as we're maturing VDI and starting to use the elasticity of cloud, you're seeing some massive benefits there, right? So that's why we do VDI and DAS. But what are the challenges on-prem then? So what we're doing, and so what I thought we'd do first is just cover off a few of the more sort of obvious technical challenges, and we'll deep dive into some of the cost model pieces slightly after that. So with one of my favorite bits of AVD has been, and George did a session on this earlier in the series, is around the profiles. Profiles in VDI and DAS have always been problematic, right? And particularly as we go to that multi-session environment where we've got multiple users on the same VM, loading the profiles, managing them, corruption of them, all that type of thing has been a huge headache for us in IT, and then obviously impacts the end user and their experience. AVD and Microsoft bought a product called FS Logics, which AVD consumes as part of its service, and that actually puts a profile into a VHD which attached, so we get much more cleaner experience for the users, less work for us as IT guys to problem solve, and they get a much better experience. So, and of course, all those things add up and help the operational costs of a VDI solution. We've also enhanced in AVD the teams, and again, and most of these technical points George will have already covered off earlier in the series, but the ability to give a almost like-for-like experience with Teams in calling, right, in being able to share that workload and video and voice, etc. Right, that offloading capability is a huge benefit to us, right, and it means that we don't need as much power and grunt at the back end to try and do some of those things. And to be perfectly honest, I think on-prem, those things where we try to avoid them as much as possible. From an IT perspective, we didn't really want that challenge of trying to do this type of service and workload in a VDI things because it was hard work. The ability to offload that workload and allow teams to work in that manner has been a huge benefit. And again, it will impact the costs. Now, another area that people probably miss out and don't often think about when they're putting their cost models together is around the security. In AVD, we're consuming security that you're probably already using in a Microsoft 365, right? So when we look at that front door, we're consuming a service that already exists and is relatively straightforward and is sort of available at global scale from Microsoft. So our MFA, our conditional access, the visibility that we get through an intelligent security graph system, right, with all the log files and things that we can see. All those things we sort of take for granted in cloud because they're sort of there at our fingertips. When we have them on premise, first of all, we've got to build them, right? And then once we've built them, we've got to maintain them and we've got to look after them. And then there's other things like the size of the logs and have we got enough storage and how do we analyze them and and yeah, probably end up with multiple vendors and multiple systems in place just to try and achieve that thing. And what we get with AVD and the use of the Microsoft ecosystem is a very simple and straightforward way to consume that security configuration, which is obviously really important and would save a heck of a lot of operational costs. Right? Just further on that, obviously, when we do on-premise solutions, and been through this many times as we go through firewalls and DMZs and whatnot, well, obviously the connections are coming in and there's a lot of inbound ports and things we have to manage and configure, whereas AVD have actually thought about that and Microsoft have got a strategy where we do use a technology called reverse connect, which allows once the connection's been made to go back to the client, and that means that we don't need to open all those ports up at the front, right? So again, a lot of effort and design and operational cadence that's just not needed, right? Because we've got a smarter way of going about it. Right? So again, we're saving money, and all these things are sort of under the hood, probably quite hard to put a dollar figure on, and depends a little bit on your use cases in your environment, right? But there's definitely a lot of benefits as we move to cloud that we could just sort of take for granted going forward. Another area that has caused sort of angst in the past in on-prem systems has been the need to have probably different infrastructure to allow us to have a full desktop versus a remote app, and we'd often have different farms and different sets of kit to achieve that goal. Whereas AVD, we can publish applications from the same hospital as we're publishing desktops, and we can mix and match them and be much more efficient in the way that we go around consuming those back-end resources. And of course, as that will bring operational costs down in compute, but also that IT admin cost base as well is reduced, as we have a lot less things to administer and manage, and we're not having to do things on duplicate. Right? Keep them nice and simple. Another area where we've seen a lot of benefit, I suppose, is the insights that we get from a cloud-based system and things that are just there at our fingertips, right? Which on-premise is not impossible to do, but we would mean that we would have to build those systems and make sure that we have them tools in place, and then the ongoing management of them is much more difficult than when we've got that ready and able to consume in Azure, right? All the tool sets and the automation and the things that we could do, that's true for AVD as it is true for any other solutions that we might be building in Azure. So we can leverage all that sort of DevOps approach. We can use tool sets that are there to manage that cloud platform. On premise, obviously, we have to decide which tool sets we're going to use. If we're going to use a third party, or we're going to script that ourselves, what are we going to do? And then we've got all that maintenance of that, right? And that's much lower when we come to using a cloud-based system in Azure. So all that tool set and versatility of the automation that we can use there is at our fingertips, right? And no extra cost, right? We just need to consume it. And that's true also in monitoring and log files and all that other stuff that comes with looking after an environment in long term, right? So when we do that on prem, again, we've got all those individual systems that we have to make sure we're gathering logs from, compile them somewhere, and be able to analyze them. If we compare that and how difficult that was on-prem compared to what we're doing in Azure today, it's like chalk and cheese. I think our ability to be able to run diagnostics across log analytics and files is great. I know the team here at CubeSys do that quite a lot for our clients, and are able to sort of drill down into problems and use the tool sets that are sort of native in Azure to resolve issues much quicker, right? Rather than digging around on different log files in different VMs all over the place, we've got a central repository that we can analyze. So again, another fringe benefit of using cloud is that, and that ecosystem is that we don't have the costs that are associated with doing the same type of activity on-prem. Okay, so we've talked now about a whole bunch of sort of technical things that might impact our operational and admin costs and user experience and things, and they're a little bit softer, but let's now have a look a bit closer at some real dollars and where we can see some savings. A slide is from our friends at Microsoft, so I would say there's probably a couple of areas that might be refined, and it does depend on your use case and your business model, right? So some of these things may or may not impact you directly, but what is very clear across this graph is that there are significant cost savings in infrastructure and the approach that we take to that, and also in licensing, right? And so we'll dive into each of those in turn. But if we just quickly review this particular graph, right, we'll look at the areas that we're looking to say. The use of Windows 10 multi-session is significant. As I'm sure, as you all know, if you've been following the series, Windows 10 multi-session is only available in Azure, so it's not something we can do on-prem, and that makes a huge difference to the user experience and the management of that ecosystem, right? So we're not now looking after a server operating system for one part of our users and whatever apps they're publishing or desktops are publishing, and then a client operating system for the physical ones. We're actually using the same thing in both VDI and in our laptops and desktops. We're also able, because of the licensing benefits, to consume Azure resources at the Linux rate. In other words, when we use AVD, there is no additional cost. You don't need to buy a server license, right? So we're just consuming that as the sort of raw compute, if you like. So when you're in the Azure calculator and looking at what things are going to cost you, we should be picking them at the Linux rate, right? And no additional cost for the operating system license. We're only paying for what we actually use, and we'll go into that in more detail. So there's savings around those peaks and troughs. And one of the big things with AVD, when you use the native solution from Microsoft, is that AVD is the management plane is all free, right? And again, we'll talk about some more of the details there. And of course, one of the big hitters for us is the RDS, and I would probably put, if you're Citrix users, the Citrix or VMware licensing costs in that bucket, but we certainly don't need RDS CALs, right? So the difference there is that we're actually connecting to a Windows 10 operating system. It's a client operating system, and therefore does not need the RDS CAL, which we do when we're connecting to Citrix farms that have got Citrix server backends and server operating systems. So there's a bit of a double whammy there. There's the Microsoft server operating system that we need to purchase, right, and run for our on-prem, but then also to remotely access it, we need an RDS CAL, right? And both of those will disappear when you use AVD, because we're using Windows 10 multi-session, and we're using that client operating system, right, to get rid of the RDS CAL. So let's dive in a little bit deeper and have a look at where those savings are. Now, particularly if we're looking at DAS, this slide's about if we're looking at a full desktop. Often we're looking at the single use cases on-prem. That's something quite often the architecture and approach when we see VMware used. But when we get to the cloud, because we've got that extra confidence now in the Windows 10 operating system, in the use of FSLogix to virtualize those profiles, the whole experience is much more much better for that multi-session system. So we're actually seeing multi-session being used more and more in our client base for use cases that we wouldn't normally, and that includes things like engineering workloads, so we have GPU, so usually you would want them on their own machine and be able to give them lots of horsepower, and that we actually don't mind now having 2 or 3 of those guys on a VM, consuming that GPU and being much more cost effective for us. So multi-session is a really great way to reduce costs, and just reduces your footprint in Azure and keep control of it. And when we compare that to what we're doing on premises, it's vastly different. One of the other large areas, and this is one that we spend a lot of time in our economic assessment trying to work out and matching that up to your use cases, which we'll talk about in more detail a bit later. But when we purchase a VDI system on premise and we look at building a system, we always have to build to the peak usage, which is that red line you'll see across the top of that graph there. And the reason we have to do that is fairly obvious. I think in our data center we have to buy the compute and the storage to match the maximum possible usage, even if we sit most of the time underneath that. Well, that is certainly not the case when we use cloud and we use Azure, because what we want to do there is use our automation engine to spin up and expand out the farm as users come on, and then back in again as they log off again, right? So we can actually match the usage pretty closely to those peaks and troughs. What we'd also often recommend, and that's shown by that light green bar across the bottom of the second graph there on the right hand side, is that we might want to take advantage of reserved instances for our baseline. So if we never want to go below a certain capability within our organization, maybe you're 24/7, maybe you just want to make sure that the system's available for people to work out of hours. But we can, if we know what that baseline is, we can set that and then apply reserved instances, which obviously have significant discounts from Microsoft. It can be up to 70% for a 3-year commit. But then above that, though, we can still use that capability and automation to burst our capacity as needed, right? So we can go up and down with the actual usage within the business. Right? So when you compare that to that large capex upfront cost of having to buy kit for the maximum competitive, and let's face it, I'm 25 years in the industry, and I think I've always seen the Citrix farms and the RDS farms and things always struggling to manage with the workload that they're given, because it often goes up and we hit that ceiling. It's very hard for us to change that. We have to go and order new kit and provision it in the data center. And so we often over provision, or we struggle if we haven't got the budget, and then the users impacting their performance and capability. Whereas with AVD, we've got that ability to match the actual usage on an ongoing basis. Also true of our network costs, right? So our network costs will be very, very similar pattern, right? So of course we have to provision for that maximum on-prem and make sure that we've got all the capability that we need for that peak of usage. But when it comes to AVD in cloud, of course, our network usage and our egress costs, right, can be matched, right, and to the actual usage at the time, right. So very same sort of pattern as I've just discussed with the servers and storage. So how does that impact us, right then? And when we look at that, well, if we look at the graph on the left hand side there, we can see that it's very stepped, and more of having to sort of anticipate that peak usage and hopefully just stay above that, right? And then of course we have to invest in all the kit to be able to do that. And if we want to make a change as usage grows over time, then we're going to need to buy some more kit, and it'll be a step up again, right? And is really new. Whereas when we're in the cloud, we actually, the red lines are showing where our capex spend is, and conversely in the cloud, our OPEX spend. We pay for what we consume in that month, right? So that can grow with the business and change with the business as needed. We don't need to sort of plan that capacity in front too much. We just consume it from Azure. So when we've got a model like that, obviously you can see there's a lot of dollars there that if we can convert them from capex to opex, that we can actually leverage and keep inside the business rather than sort of spending up front. Right? Particularly when we've got things like maintenance contracts and all that type of thing over time, like that's going to impact us on longer term. The other area that was impacting our cost base was that management, and I think this is often something that's overlooked with AVD. What Microsoft have done with AVD is all the management plane, and there's quite a lot of services there. I'll discuss in a second, but they all come as a service from Microsoft that is a globally available service, and it's at zero cost, right? So there's no charge whatsoever to consume that service. What we actually pay for in AVD is just compute and storage and network, right? What we had to do on-premise in the past, obviously, was to build all that capability, right? So we needed a front door, we needed web access, we needed gateways, we needed brokers, we needed license servers, we needed the ability to manage it, and all our diagnostics and load balancing, and that all came at a cost. Not only do we have to buy the kit to do that, we also have to buy the server operating systems for all those tools and capabilities to sit on, and then we have to buy, well, if you're using Citrix, you'd have that extra Citrix licensing, and then you've got to manage and look after all that. So there's operational IT admin costs that come along with that. We're saying when we in AVD is all of that is provided for free as part of the service, right? So it's a huge cost savings and probably time and effort saving that we gained by moving to cloud and using VDI in that way. And then probably one of the biggest is the licensing area, right? So one of the largest savings we see most of our organizations make when they move from on-prem systems, so outside of the actual sort of kit and storage and compute that they need, is around licensing. And as we've already discussed and touched on, when we use AVD, all we need is a Windows 10 license. And there's about 5 or 6 different ways you can get that, including M365, right? So most organizations and enterprises would have Windows 10 in their licensing agreement already, and they're using it for their laptops and desktops, right? So once you have that box ticked, you do not need RDS CALs anymore, right? Which we do on-prem because we're attaching to a server operating system. We don't need that server operating system either because we're using Windows 10 multi-session. So there's quite a big difference in the licensing costs and significant savings to be had there. I know we've worked in the last sort of 18 months, 2 years with a number of organizations who have been moving technology stacks and have saved significant numbers, right? Like hundreds of thousands of dollars in licensing, and that's funded the project to move them from on-prem into the cloud, and then they've gained all that flexibility and scalability, right? And at the same time, are saving money. So RDS CALs, and then of course our Citrix or VMware ones are optional savings you may wish to take advantage of. Smaller one, just a little side note, really, if you're incumbent with Windows 7 applications that you can't get off that Windows 7 operating system, and yes, we do have at least one client that have got some of those and need to maintain a Windows 7 operating system, rather than doing it on your physical hardware where you have to pay for extended security updates. If you move it to AVD, all that comes for free, right? Now Windows 7 in AVD can only be used in a single one-to-one mode. You can't do multi-session, but you do get all the security updates and things from Microsoft for free, right? They just come with the image that they provide on there, and we can utilize that up there. So that's another side benefit or small benefit to AVD. Okay, which brings us around to sort of labor costs and that, and I think I've indicated that through most of this conversation, is that there's often two sets of savings. So there's the sort of more obvious CapEx type savings around kit and licensing and all the pieces of things, but there's also operational savings, and those labor costs can be significant. If we think back to that control plane, not having to look after anything at all in that piece, is an evergreen service for Microsoft that we just connect to and use, compared to having to look after your own control plane and all the management pieces. That's significant savings, right? And it's ongoing savings because you're just not needing to look after it anymore and update it and do sort of version control and all that sort of thing in there, right? So all that sort of disappears and we get to consume that, right? So we have much lower labor costs when we look at a PaaS service like that. Okay. So building a business case. I might just pause there for a second and see if there's any questions on any of that cost analysis, I suppose, around AVD, comparing it to on-prem, before we go and talk about how we might build up a business case for AVD. I'll just pause for a second. Silence is golden. Right.
Paul.
Yes, go for it. Was that Dom? Did you have one?
You go, Dom.
No, it wasn't me.
Oh, okay. It might be just you then, Andy.
I was just getting some feedback here, sorry. I was going to just suggest on the previous slide the automation that you referred to in operate and the benefits of operational management. You can also benefit from that automation in terms of using the elasticity and automation capabilities in the cloud to provide more cost benefits as well by scaling storage to unused storage to a less expensive SKU, that sort of thing as well. So it's not just the operational simplicity that comes with it. There's lots of other benefits that are available there as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. So obviously you know well, Andy, that and help our client base with that. The capability of the automation is fantastic in that sphere, and it does impact the cost directly. So we do things like as a VM is switched off and people are not using it, not only do we turn the compute off, but we can also change the storage that compute's been held on, right? So we can go from SSD, which is obviously giving the users a great experience and what we need while it's running, to just a standard HDD when it's off, right? And that will obviously reduce the cost base, and there's keeping a tight control on things going out and back in again, right? And that's storage, and that's compute, and that's network, right? Definitely has a significant impact on the cost and running costs. Yeah.
Spot on. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do we go about building a business case? This is probably one part of VDI and DAS that hasn't changed over the years, right? And it doesn't change when we go to the cloud either, right? And it's really important that if we're building up that business case, that we understand the groups of users, and we often hear terms like personas and use cases and all that sort of things. What they really boil down to is that we need to understand the groups of users within our business and what applications they consume. Right, so once they come to use VDI, well, what is it they need to be able to do their job on a daily basis? Right? Which 5 or 6 or 10 applications are they going to interact with and use within VDI? And it's really important that we understand them and group them, right, so that we can assess them individually. Because once we do that and we have a look at those applications and their sort of usage patterns, then we can start to put those users into and the groups of users into different types, which is that part B there on the slide in front of you. And then we'll sit them into, are they light users, medium, heavy, or super heavy when they're going graphics and heavy intensive GPU type stuff. And that helps us design the back end of AVD so that we can be as cost effective as possible, right? And so if we just got really sort of light users, we sort of web access type applications, and we can put them into a light, and we can put more of them onto a multi-session, and you can squeeze out the sort of benefits of that. And then we obviously tier them up through medium, heavy, and graphics, right? So we group our users into those sort of use cases and where they are. We understand the application workloads, and we fit those application workloads into a type of user we can assign a set of resources to. And then we'll have a look at where they're migrating from, right? So so we can also assess the licensing that might be needed, and any infrastructure drivers in there that might be affecting the overall business case or personas, right? So we gather all that information, and once we've gathered all that, like I say, we can start then to apply that to the type of compute and storage that we need for each of those use cases, right? And then once we've worked out the compute and the sort of the OS disk size for the size of apps and all that type of thing, right, we can then start to refine what our architecture will look like, and then obviously the costs that are associated with that. Big part of that obviously is storage. I mean, do we need that higher end capabilities of Azure NetApps where we get control over the IOPS, and it's a sort of enterprise grade storage solution, which we certainly need for larger AVD environments? Or are we okay with Azure Files? Is that going to be appropriate for the size that we're working with, or the demands of the applications that are on the VDI? Or, well, I don't think we've ever used a file server. I think this is a bit of a Microsoft just in case slide deck, but I wouldn't normally use a file server because we don't really need that overhead of an extra server on there. And then we obviously have to do the same thing.
Paul, sorry to interrupt. So when you say file server in the storage section, are you referring to file server just for the storage of the environment files?
Yeah,
we're not talking about user files.
Yeah. In the early parts of probably more when it was back with Windows Virtual Desktop rather than AVD, some of the early projects used an actual file server. So they provisioned an IaaS server in Azure. And we would put the profiles and stuff on there.
Right.
It's matured. We really want to move towards those PaaS services. So I don't think we've ever recommended a file server at CubeSys. I think it's always been Azure files and NetApp files for the larger environments. Right? And the NetApp files is really around us controlling the IOPS so that we can control the experience for the users for things like log on storms in the morning and things like that. Right?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah. Same goes for the network, right? So we need to, Dom, you probably know from your own experiences that connectivity and the appropriate connectivity with a VDI solution, especially when we're in hybrid mode, when a lot of the things that the desktop is consuming are still on premises, that we need to make sure the network's in the right size and shape. Right?
Yeah,
it's appropriate. So we bring all those things that starts come into the puzzle now, right? And then we can start to work out what our cost base is. So we have models where we can calculate, once we understand those personas, those groups of users and the type of applications they're consuming, and their size and shape that they need then to be able to give them a good experience and an appropriate experience at the right price. We can build those in. That's that green area there you're seeing on the chart. We can build all those things up, and you might in your organization also need to look at things like the device or the IT labor that goes for ongoing or setup as well. Right? Build that into your business case, and then compare it to what you've got right now, right? And then compare and contrast. And you'll see, I think what we're trying to illustrate there on that top part of the slide, and then the highlighted user group one, is not all use cases will have like a huge savings, and it really depends on what they are. The heavier the use case, often that's harder to see the sort of differential and the benefits of AVD, but certainly on the mass side, we do see often quite significant cost savings, right? As we've discussed, especially if we have usage going up and down, right? And we can map to that through automation. So what we did at CubeSys, obviously, we're seeing we've done over 45 projects, I think, now in AVD, and obviously we saw along that journey that our client base was obviously often quite excited by the technology, often looking for that remote user solution as part of the COVID and pandemic situation we're in. But then as things have progressed, it's like, well, we need to justify this, and we need to make sure the numbers add up and the business case is solid, right, and work through it. So CubeSys thought we would step in and help them with an assessment. So what we have available to our client base is an engagement where we will build you an economic plan for AVD and also give you a roadmap to get there. So I'll just explain that a little bit. What we cover off is we'll build you an economic model. So all the cost base and operational costs of that, right, will help you understand the implementation costs, or those one-off costs to set things up and timelines involved. Through the engagement, we ask you a set of questions and look at your environment to check how ready you are. So we have that technical readiness piece in there. We can also help you choose between AVD and Windows 365 depending on that persona set and use case that you might have. So which one's going to be the most beneficial for you? And then we'll build out that technical roadmap so you can actually address that and see the progress to get there. What you get out of that is you get a confidence of the actual operational numbers. So we're going to quite a bit of detail, and I'll show you some of that in a second. You know that what you need to do to get ready. So are you ready, or are there things that need to be put in place? Do I need to put ExpressRoute in place, or expand the size of ExpressRoute, or is there some barriers internally with security that I need to overcome? I'll help you understand what that roadmap might look like and give you some confidence around that. And then help you sort of understand that end user value, right, from AVD, right? So this is the process that we use, right? So we ask, sit down with you and ask you to fill out a questionnaire, and we'll help you through that. And then usually we go and analyze that result and hold a workshop to sort of just make sure we've got the understanding right. And then one of our CubeSys consultants here would go away with all that information and build out a report, right, and then present that report back to you. So what I've just got, I think, here is a couple of those things I can show you to give you a flavour of what you get. So this is the questionnaire that we fill out using 365 forms. So we go through a set of questions, talk to you about the different applications and personas and things. So it's really trying to get an understanding of your business, what type of applications we're going to be using, and size and shape and things so on. So we fill that questionnaire out, and then we would hold a workshop to confirm it, and then we'll come to building out a report. And you'll see, I'll just skim through this quickly. Hold there. we actually got into quite a bit of detail in these economic assessments. So not only do we want to build out the numbers for you, which I'll show you, we do go into quite a bit of detail. We also might be comparing and contrasting to what you've got on site now with a Citrix farm. We'll look at those technical roadmap to get there. So like, you know, what are the hurdles that we need to overcome? What's the likely timeline for those, right? So you'll see all of that through the reports. I just skimmed through it now. But most importantly, make sure that you have the numbers right and you can present them back to your leadership team. So we'll give you an overall summary and some of the benefits, some sample costs, right? In this one, this sample, we've got a compare and contrast between two different sets of users there. So the sort of permanent employees versus seasonal workers and the type of applications they use and type of compute they might want at some time, right, in different parts of the year. You'll see that we've calculated all those sort of hours and of usage, the applications used for the right size of VMs, etc. Right, give you an overview of the landscape, some comparing and contrasting some tools in this sample, right, between Nerdio and Citrix, and pros and cons and benefits of that. What's your readiness level? So are you ready to consume AVD? Let's look at the architecture, right? So we've got a really good grounding for your business case, right? And you can see the steps you need to do. You'll see us then go into a lot of the detail, join the individual VMs, network, storage in a lot more detail, right? So spelling all that out step by step on an overall monthly cost estimate for each user. And we'll go down, drill down. What I also want to show you in there is that we do put together an adoption plan. So through that workshop and questionnaire, we've got enough information and our knowledge of AVD projects, we can build together a sort of timeline for you to go over and have a look at. So that's what we do for our assessments. Any questions on that?
No. Paul, so as we're existing AVD users. So as I mentioned earlier, so if we want to look at use cases for expanding or providing a new service offering to prison-based staff, would we need to go through the process in terms of the questionnaire, the workshop, and the report, or could we?
Probably do a lighter version for that, Dom, because a lot of what we cover off is actually establishing AVD.
That's right. So we're basically just saying we want to add, I don't know, let's say 30 users who are a particular user group. So they're a unique user group. They're not standard correctional services user group. So we want to cost out what that would look like for just that cohort of users. We know that they would be, you know, a light to medium user type, and migration type, it's sort of like, anyone's guess, but let's say it's a Windows 10 desktop currently using another agency's Citrix farm, sitting on the DCS network and using 3 DCS applications. So in our mind, we think, you know, notwithstanding the technical issues and limitations that are presented from a network carriage perspective, we need to get that sorted out first in terms of whose network are we going to be running on. And then based on that, the outcome of that is going to then dictate the future state, which we believe is going to be a health connected network with a health provisioned and configured end user device with an AVD client sitting on that, because they're all part of the state tenancy from a Microsoft perspective, and therefore we can just give them access to our AVD and tell them how much it's going to cost. Is that the correct assessment?
I think I think you're on the right lines. And look, back to this slide. I'll just jump back to that one. That approach is still valid for what you're doing. What you probably need is a much cut down version of what we normally do for a full economic assessment. We need to understand that cohort of users. So like, what's the application usage? It sounds like you're already halfway there. You know, they're going to be around that light medium. What we then need to do is, and you've probably seen that from us before, Dom, is that in AVD it's also really important to understand the usage patterns. So what we did in the past when we buy our big capex thing, we talk about peaks, and so we just talk about the maximum, right? But if you really want to dive into the cost model and understand the ongoing costs in AVD, we need to understand the usage patterns in more detail. And what I mean by that is, well, how many users are likely to be on between 9 and 5? How many are on after, from 5 to 10 p.m? How many are 24/7? Are the weekends impacted? And so we've just done an economic assessment for an organisation that had quite a varied mix, right? So they have early users of sort of maybe 20% of their workforce, and then a really busy sort of 9 to 5, and then maybe 30% in the evenings, and some Saturdays, because they were open on a Saturday, right? So their business was triaging. So getting all those different, even though it was the same persona and same group of users, understanding when they use the system, for how long and how many people, are really important, because we are matching the consumption of Azure to those number of users on board, and that impacts the dollars quite directly, right? And it's the biggest factor that we need to understand within your business to get an accurate assessment of the cost of AVD.
I know, and that's the challenge we face, because noting that these users are prison based, and therefore it's a 24/7 by 365 operation. It's not, every day is the same day. So, and because it's prison health, you can't predict when they're going to have to access the system because of the work they do.
So we'd have to make some estimates. And look, that's part of what that workshop is actually having conversations that eke out those answers, and we sort of think what is a reasonable level to be at, right? And we make some assumptions in there. As long as we document them, we can always adjust the numbers later, but if we find them to be wrong. But look, what we're trying to eke out there is that usage pattern that you have inside of your business, right? So that we can match the dollars to that, right? Because there's a direct correlation between the amount of usage and the ongoing cost, which it wasn't true.
That's right.
It certainly is going forward, and that's obviously often to your benefit, right? So it's a benefit to sell to the senior management team and the business for them to understand what the ongoing cost is, but it's also a benefit because it should be less than that capex cost. So we've got on-prem. Right?
Yeah.
Cool. Any more questions? Because I think I'm just going to jump back to I think we're on the last slide there. Right? So we covered off most of the areas I wanted to do. Yeah. Just on the end. Any comments from my team or any because I know you guys actually run through these assessments and work with our clients quite directly on an ongoing basis. Any observations from you guys?
Paul, it's Andy here. I'll just add, knowing your use cases and your maximum user concurrencies, and therefore the maximum amount of compute you're going to need to serve those peak usage numbers, and the times that it happens are sort of key. We've got a lot of experience in this field and can come up with some pretty rounded, accurate estimates for you. But the more idea you have about that, the more value you're going to get out of it. So that's key, knowing your usage profiles, like Paul alluded to before. And then understanding the times that they need to be operating, and we can align sort of cost estimates to that then, and you really realise your potential savings.
Yeah.
So are you able to, through configuring the environment, cost up from a cross-charge perspective exactly what a business could pay for a component of the service?
Well, he sounds like you need to come to our next session, Dom. Right? So
I think I do. Yeah.
We're covering off in the next session is, and again, rounding out our sort of offerings to our client base is what is that ongoing cost? Because when we do an economic assessment, we're estimating going forward, and we're budgeting. So industry figures and budgets are never exactly what is there. And when we do that, well, how can we be sure that the right business unit or a set of users are actually paying their fair share in there?
Yeah.
And what QVCs have worked on, and we have an app now in the Azure marketplace that actually allows you to extract that information from Azure. All right, so in your tenant, you could be able to point our application at your tenant and be able to pull out all the AVD related costs, and then we also look at the user log on, log off times. Right, so then we're able to provide you a cost for each user per month, which is often where we get to with billing or chargebacks or showbacks to the business.
Yeah.
But also what it costs per session. right? So they'll ask that. We have got clients where one user might use a sort of generic desktop in AVD for some of the week, but they might jump onto sort of like a high-end GPU-based one, which is obviously a much more expensive compute cost to that session, and we can actually tell you the difference when we show them each of those costs, right? So we've got a session in 2 weeks' time when we do our next discussion series where we'll deep dive into how we can do chargeback, or if you're not an organization that needs chargeback, I think it's really important from an IT management perspective to have showback. So I can go and have a conversation with my business about what it is actually costing and which users cost what, right, to provide the service, right? And that's I think really powerful to have that sort of granularity. And if I think back to my old infrastructure management days, like being able to justify, you know, the extra compute I needed in the data center, or show them uses, and then each business unit would argue about how much they'd actually used, right?
Yeah.
You usually end up on a sort of rounding it out to the number of users, which may or may not be fair, right? So we've got a bit of detail on that, and there's quite a few nuances in there once you get into the detail, which we'll go through in the next section. We've got some quite cool ways of manipulating the costs to associate them with each user, right?
Does that then put an onus on the way you design or deploy the solution? So we're talking about Cloud Clarity here.
Yes, Cloud Clarity for AVD is our product. Yes,
yeah.
I think there's a natural feedback loop done, right? So if you can see those usage and we analyze that pattern more, and we can see what time they're using it, because obviously we'll know the log on and log off time specifically, so we know if there's peaks in the week or in the month, etc. We can start then feedback into the design and tweak the automation and tweak the sort of AVD platform to get the best economic result for you, right? So and there's definitely a feedback loop there, right? Just needs a bit of time. You need to analyze that over a few months.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Any more questions?
Not from me, mate. I think that covers everything.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining. Just a reminder that we do have session 7, I'll spit out, in 2 weeks' time, same place, same time, and we will be covering off chargeback models and how we analyse the costs, what it is actually costing us to do that. So we'll take you through our tool that allows you to do that in quite some detail, which will be exciting to see that in action. Awesome. And with that, I think we'll call it a wrap. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, guys. Excellent.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
See ya.